I gotta write this down because my memory is real short. What was the question again? Pangea and Indians. Indians in America, right. It is a fact. The Earth has plates that are moving some. There are cracks along those plates called fault lines. That we'll put in the fact column. The Earth has plates, they are moving some. Now, does that prove it has always been moving for millions of years? Or could it have just started moving 4,400 years ago at the worldwide flood? Could have been either way. There's no way to prove that scientifically. It is a fact that South America looks like it would fit with Africa. If you moved them together, they look like they would fit. Okay, here's a map of the world, of that part of the world. South America and Africa have a similar continental shape. Nobody argues with that. Now, does that prove they ever were together? Of course not. This building would fit with the library if you moved them next to each other, but it doesn't prove they broke apart 80 million years ago, right? That is not evidence at all. Pangea is taken on very sketchy evidence. The other thing they don't take into account, so they're moving. Well, maybe they started 2,000 miles apart, and after the flood, they've moved, 50 miles in the last 4,400 years. Also, if you remove the water from the ocean, there's dirt under there, okay? The continents are not lily pads floating on a pond. There is a solid crust to this Earth which goes under the ocean also. So, they don't just move around that easily. Yes, they are moving a little bit. I say that's just leftover movement from the flood 4,400 years ago. And the Earth is still experiencing a little bit of shifting, and some mountains are still going up, and there are still earthquakes and volcanoes. But that's leftover remnants of this disaster from 4,400 years ago. It is also a fact that the oceans have two distinct parts to them. We have what's called the abyss, the deep part of the ocean. 15,000 feet is the average depth. And then all around the continent is a continental shelf. A cross-section of the ocean, if you could imagine this in your mind, we're going to draw a cross-section. Now you got to understand that less than 1% of the ocean floor has been explored. Way less than 1%. I called the people in Washington, D.C. that make the maps and said, now these contours you have on the ocean floor, how much of that is science and how much is that interpretation? And the lady in charge said, well, we've explored less than 1%, so 99% of that is guesswork. But let's assume it's reasonable. I'm not going to argue with that. The ocean, here's the continents, then there's a continental shelf, and then it drops off into the abyss. This area is called the continental shelf right here, where the water is less than 1,000 feet deep. Most people say less than 1,000 feet is considered continental shelf. Then you have the continental rise down to the abyss, where it's 15,000 feet deep, as opposed to 1,000. If you lowered the oceans 1,000 feet, if you could remove 1,000 feet of water out of the oceans, the continents would become huge. All the continental shelves would be exposed. England would not be an island. England would be part of the mainland. The English Channel would just be a valley you would walk across. Actually, if the oceans were lowered by just 1,000 feet, the Indians could walk to America from either side. You could walk across Iceland and Greenland and Canada. It would all be connected by lowering the oceans. So, here's the creationist worldview of what happened. Go back to my timeline. 4,000 years ago, BC, the creation. 1,600 years later, the flood. After the flood, the ice caps were huge, all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. If you trap that much water in the form of ice, you're going to lower the oceans considerably. So for the first couple of hundred years after the flood, the people were able to walk literally any place in the world. As the languages, after the Tower of Babel incident in the Bible, when the languages were created, the people broke up into their small inbreeding groups, and they traveled any place they felt like traveling. You could walk to Australia. There was no water in the way. If you lower the water, if you lower the ocean, that's a fact. There's a land bridge to every place. So for the first couple of hundred years, the people dispersed around the world, including to America. And then as the melting ice caps caused the water to rise, the continents became separated. The Bible says in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Well, Peleg lived, where's my chart here? Peleg was born 100 years after the flood, by the dates given in the Bible, and he lived for 239 years. During Peleg's time, the Bible says the earth was divided. I think that means a couple of things. I think that's when the earth was divided up into the different languages and consequently nationalities. I think the people that were in these small inbreeding groups developed unusual traits. Black skin might have been a mutation, or white skin might have been a mutation that took hold. When the population was small, a mutation can catch on quickly. I don't have any problems with mutations. I don't have any problems with natural selection. Natural selection works, but it doesn't prove evolution. It might prove creation. Natural selection is not evidence for either side of this argument. It has nothing to do with the argument. After the flood, the populations began to spread out, and they could come over to America or any place they felt like, and the oceans kept coming up deeper and deeper and deeper. Maybe for a 400 or 500 year span, the ice caps were advancing and retreating, maybe for 1,000 years. During that time, cities would be built near the beach and consequently have to be abandoned as the waters come up. And maybe that's why we have legends of lost cities like Atlantis, and why there are some unusual features underwater. You know, there's some, looks like buildings in 30 feet deep water down by, Bermuda. That could be explained from the flood. The consequences of the global changes, the climate changes, would cause a rising and lowering of the ocean, I think, pretty dramatically. So a long answer to a short question. The creationist would say the continental shelf was exposed, and that's why we have underwater erosional features like there are canyons bigger than Grand Canyon underwater, which means it must have been above water, or it wouldn't erode like that. Okay? Yes, sir.
One question about the Pangea theory. They have found fossils that match up on the coast, the northeastern coast of South America and the in coast of Africa that match, and they're found nowhere else but right in a specific area. And when they're put together, there is an area population of these animals and rocks that are found nowhere else in the
I would argue that they're not found anywhere else. Nearly every type of fossil is found nearly every place. Dinosaurs, camels have been found near the North Pole. Now you can look at that two different ways. The North Pole used to be at the equator and the Earth has tipped, or the North Pole has moved, continental drift. Or the world was perfect before the flood and camels lived at the North Pole. Or the flood lasting a year could have floated the dead carcasses any place in the world. So the fact that there are similar fossils found on both continents does not disprove the creation model. It might prove there was a flood 4,400 years ago and the dead animals drifted to those places and that's where they landed.
But there's also, when they find, well, I guess it wouldn't be the same, but they find polarized rocks that through time periods switch polarization like a time clock, and they find that they match up.
Magnetized rocks.
Right. And they match up almost exactly on the two coasts when they put them together. The stones that they find are, I don't know how to quite put it.
Yeah, he's right. The geological evidence is very extensive on this, and it's not based on the geometric matching of the patterns. For example,
and it's not so much biological.
That's a trivial part of it.
Right.
The details of the geology that's been accomplished over the years, 20 years, 60s and 70s, is really what proves this. It's not sketchy.
No, doesn't prove this. This is evidence that's interpreted for the continental drift.
Yeah, it's definitely a theory. Yeah,
definitely a theory. If you would look at the actual maps that have been made of the magnetic lines at the bottom of the ocean, they are nowhere close to what appears by the time it gets into the textbook.
How do you know if it's only 1% explored?
That's the point. It's only 1% explored. It could be that the mid-Atlantic ridge is one of the rips where the fountains of the deep broke up. If the Earth ripped open right there, the rocks would be twisted all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, I've seen the evidence for this, and it's not like you say. It is conclusive.
It is catastrophic down there at the bottom. Thomas G. Barnes is probably the world's expert in geomagnetism. He's a University of El Paso, Texas physics professor. He just retired here a couple years ago. He's written many papers for the government on the Earth's magnetic field. Thomas G. Barnes, because of his intensive research in the Earth's magnetic field, has become a creationist.